Hey, Mike, thanks for being part of the show today on Shaboom.
Hey, you're welcome. I am very happy to be here with my fellow baby boomer.
Well, this is the Mother's Day show, the Mother's Day special, as I like to say. And I know a couple things. One, I know how close you were to your mom and how she was such an influence in your life. Um, but your agencies, in my opinion, were always successful because you built such wonderful culture. You know, I say to this, I never met anybody at your agencies that I didn't like. I mean, it was almost like everybody you hired was somebody that you would have in your house for dinner. Did that come from your mom? That kind of cultural feel or that love of people or that camaraderie?
Appreciate the comment. I'm not sure every one of them I would have had for dinner, but most of them for sure. Um, you know, I was thinking about this, and one of my mom's question to me, I would come home and whether it was when I was 5 years old or, you know, 25 years old, and I'd complain about somebody or something, she would ask me this question, Rick. She would say, what does it cost to be kind? And I don't know, Mom. She goes, doesn't cost anything to be kind. And it's one of the values that she most instilled in me, and I've tried to instill in my kids. And I think did permeate a lot of culturally, you know, what we did, why we had great relationships with our clients, and, you know, why we would hire the kind of people that we did. You know, kindness goes a long way. It sounds so trite, but how often do you get into a conversation or you're with somebody and, you know, a simple thank you or a simple please goes a long way. And, you know, I'm not sure she would recognize the world we're in today because kindness is can be very scarce, right? And you know, she would always say, look for the good in people, you know. And I'll tell that to my son in particular, Charlie, and, you know, sometimes he'll roll his eyes because, you know, they'll have a difficult time with people. And, you know, I said, try to look for the good, you know, see if you can find it and bring that out of them. So those were some real lessons that I took from her. Now, my mom could be really tough. And my mom would also say, you know, there are people in this world that, you know, do the walking and people who are walked on. You don't want to be the latter. So, you know, there was strength in that woman. I got to tell you a quick story just to put my mom in perspective. And there's a trail of very, I would say, earnest, tough, you know, if not powerful women in my life over many generations. My mom was an original member of NOW, the National Organization of Women. And so she was all about, you know, women's rights. And of course, you know, my mom was there in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act, and she was a big supporter of Lyndon Johnson. And, you know, she was a liberal in her time. But I think I was about 10 years old. And the baby boomers will remember an artist called Helen Reddy. And Helen did that song, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. And I'm like 10 years old. I had two sisters, older sisters. And my mom gave me the 45, remember the 45 discs of that song. So I would play it and hear it and respect it and learn from it. I am woman, hear me roar. That was my mom. The same woman said, you know, be kind and find the good in people. So yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the values that shaped me were from her and certainly were, you know, instrumental in how I looked at surrounding myself with people that, you know, could feel the same way. I've never understood how people who are rude and ruthless succeed, but that's just me.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other trait that I so admire in you, we've been friends for nearly 40 years. I've never heard you use the word I. You always use the word we. And and that's quite rare um, these days. It does take a village. It takes more than one person, and I got to believe that your mom and your dad instilled that into you too. And you were a team sport guy. You played soccer, so you understood that. I remember when I first went to Advantage. I had been a basketball guy, and I go to Advantage, and they're all tennis players. they all play
That's
by
true.
themselves, and I'm like,
Yeah.
no, no. In my sport, we play together. But I love that about you. Did your mom kind of instill that in you to you too?
Yeah, we're talking about moms, so and I was listening to Shaboom from last week with about Cowboys and with Gordon White in there, and you hit some themes about teammates, your and coaching, your reunion with your guys, and Gordon had some reminiscences. So when I was a kid, I had some, I would say social traumas, some bullying, maybe not as many friends as the next person. And my mom, who was my biggest fan, you know, she would she would say, "Yeah, but tell me about your friends." I had a few friends, and she would always say, "Michael, it's really not about the quantity of friends you have and how popular you are. It's about your quality of your friends." The quality. Do you have really good friends, or do you have a lot of friends that, maybe aren't going to have your back, or you're maybe not going to have their back? So it was always about quality over quantity. And, to this day, I live that. I have some couple friends from third grade. In my wedding party, had five people from college, two people from Connecticut, and one an old friend of ours that dearly, that passed, Kevin Platte. And of course, you were at my wedding, by the way. And I have some of the very best friends in the world, and I hold that near and dear. And I watched that with my dad as he grew up in his business, so the closeness of his friends, and my mom, so it matters. Relationships really matter, and strong relationships matter, and relationships with people that you can depend on matter. It's rare to have friendships where you can really depend on somebody to have your back, and that really taught me a lot. And shaped how I looked at the people that I was fortunate and blessed enough to surround myself with, including you, Rick, who
No, I appreciate that.
we've come together after being frenemies for many years.
Yeah, it's been a joy. I mean, this project's been just so much fun working with you. Tell me the story now. It's kind of interesting for baby boomers to go back and say that our grandparents and our grandmothers were strong women because of the fact that previous generations it wasn't necessarily that way. Talk about
Yeah.
that story. Yeah.
Well, no, thanks for asking. So, and a couple of them. I'm from my family. Uh, my grandmother and her five sisters on my dad's side were immigrants. They came over in the first decade of the 1900s from Ukraine, from Kiev, um, and they moved to Brooklyn. And the woman in this family, very strong ladies, went to work in the garment district in New York, down in Brooklyn. They actually were in the building. Three, my grandmother and two of her sisters were in the building where the, famous Triangle Garment Factor was. It's a building that at the time was the largest industrial fire in New York City, where basically there were young immigrant women, teenagers, early 20s in the garment business, and hundreds of young women died. And the story, where I don't know if it's legend or not, that my grandmother and her sister had to jump from a second floor window to get out because back in those days there wasn't easy access to get into doors and they were all locked. So the fire department had to rescue all these people climbing down ladders, and they never got to my the story has it. But there were also suffragettes. They were on the tail end. The women's right to vote, I think, was like around 1920 during the Woodrow
Right,
Wilson
1920. Yeah.
1920, and they were very much out there protesting in New York City for probably 15 years from the time they first got their feet onto Ellis Island and came to working in a really tough business where women were basically kind of slave labor in that garment district, protesting for the right to vote. And we got photographs of them holding up signs, and those black and white grainy photographs holding up signs protesting for a woman's right to vote, which of course had its roots in the mid 1800s with a lot of brave women before them all over the country. But it's something that kind of that strength, that vigor, that need to vote for the righteous justice was something that was just in the family's blood from the very beginning. Strong woman. And as we call her, Nana Goldie, she could make a good gefilte fish, and she could make a good borscht, and she could make a good chopped liver, but you didn't want to cross Nana Goldie. Okay, she was a tough, very, very proud woman. So now on my wife's side, Liz's side, her grandmother was worked the assembly lines in World War II, and out in Santa Barbara, California. And her and some of her mates after the war had this idea that they deserved some land, okay, just that they could invest in. It's a very progressive woman that way. And so her and these 3 or 4 women squatted on some land in Santa Barbara and eventually were deeded this land. And guess what? They turned that land into apartment buildings that have been renovated. And today, my father-in-law owns 3 or 4 apartment buildings in Santa Barbara off the squatting of Liz's grandmother, Carol. So again, and of course, Liz in her own right was a very strong and determined woman. So there is a lot of, let's put it this way, my mother's relationship with Helen Reddy has definitely borne fruit over the years.
Wow. And you have a very strong daughter, too, that I think is going to be the next generation of strong women that are making a difference and all that. You told a story the other day I want you to talk about, that your mom gave you a copy of The Joy of Cooking. And she wrote you a note in it. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's funny. You have these keepsakes, like we all have them, and I have a couple. I've got one, The Joy of Cooking, and my mom, was like, basically wrote a beautiful note. You're on your own. You have to, don't depend on anybody, and you've got to, take care of yourself. So love mom, start cooking, basically. The other one that she did, I have gosh, if you're younger, you probably don't even know what a Roget's thesaurus is. But, I got, as I started high school, I got an American Heritage Dictionary and a Roget's thesaurus. And in both of them, she wrote, Michael, knowledge is power, go for it, love mom. And yeah, so now I have to just tell another thing. You rummage through things years ago. This has nothing to do with moms. This is just a sidebar. When you just find things that you forgot about. I was cleaning out my attic, and I was looking. I had all these albums, vinyl albums, and you had the double albums. And I'd forgotten that in college we used those to clean our weed. And get all the seeds and the stems out. And I found all these albums with weed in them. I was like, and I was with my son at the time. He was, like 12 or 13. And he's, Dad, what is all that stuff? I said, well, you need to know some things about your dad.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Of course, we said we didn't do any of that. We didn't. We were always on time. We never missed curfew. We didn't know drugs. We didn't do any drinking, and we certainly didn't have premarital sex. So no, of
That
course
was,
we did.
yeah,
We did
those are
that.
my roommates. Those are my roommates'
Yeah,
albums.
exactly. Blame somebody.
Yeah,
From that
yeah,
standpoint.
yeah.
You mentioned your late wife, Liz, and she was a strong woman. I mean, again, she was a very astute woman. It's interesting, Mike, if you look at your story of your grandmother and your story of your mom, Charlotte's mom, Betsy, is almost 90. And had she been in Charlotte's generation, she would be the CEO somewhere.
Mhm.
It's just different. And I think there were women in your past that probably would have emerged, but they just didn't have the same opportunities. But I'll tell a funny story about her. She had been a school teacher, and her dad owned the bank in Live Oak, and she was the oldest of 10. Well, the boys all got great jobs at the bank, and the girls all got to be tellers at the bank. And the
Mhm.
boys made all kinds of money, and the girls made like minimum wage.
Mhm.
Well, Barnett Bank came in and bought the bank, fired all the boys, and made Betsy the head of the bank. so, so sometimes things, what goes around comes around sometimes. But talk a little bit about Liz and kind of her career and how she was as a mom.
Well, I appreciate that. So, you know, I will say this about my mom and Liz. We lost them both too early. My mom was 62, Liz was 55, but they both got a lot out of those years. Which is always the blessing that I look back on. Um, well, Rick, you might remember this. This is a good summary of Liz. So, as a lot of people know, one of the traditions in a Jewish wedding is we break a glass. So as we're getting married, as we've just been betrothed, the man, the man, the rabbi puts the glass on the floor, and the man stomps on the glass and breaks it. When the rabbi put the glass down for our wedding, Liz physically pushed me out of the way and said, "I'm stepping on this
I'm
glass."
doing that exactly.
And
Yeah,
she did,
that
high
is
heels
such
and
a,
all.
that I had forgotten that. That is such a great memory. That is so cool.
And that's Liz. Look, she was a journalist. That's how we met. She was a sports marketing journalist, sports television. And, back in the kind of early to mid 80s, women journalists weren't really in the locker rooms reporting. Okay, it was segregated. And there's some women, rightfully so, that were given a lot of credit for being the pioneering women journalists. Leslie Visser of CBS, Christine Brennan, who was of the Miami Herald and has done a lot with NBC and other networks, I believe. Melanie Hauser, who was with the Houston Chronicle. Not as well known, Liz was in that crowd of people, was friends with Leslie, knew Christine. And so she was a reporter. And by golly, there was nobody that was going to keep her out of the locker room if there was a story to be told. She covered a few boxing matches and got to know Sugar Ray Leonard a little bit. And I wouldn't say they became friends, but they were friendly. And one day, Sugar Ray Leonard said to Liz, you're a good reporter. You report like a man. And Liz looked at him and scolded him and said, Sugar Ray, I don't report like a man. I report like a woman. and that's better, you know. So,
The great
and
story. That
and
kind of
she,
summed her up pretty well. Yeah.
yeah, it did sum her up. And she was very ambitious in that way. She later worked at Golf Digest. She was one of the few female editors at Golf Digest, and the story goes that Jerry Tardy, the wonderful editor of Golf Digest for decades, would take all the guys to Pine Valley to play golf, with advertisers and customers. And of course, Pine Valley, I don't know if they still have this rule, but back in the day, women could get on the course Sundays after 4 o'clock, and that was it. So of course, Liz wasn't invited, which pissed her off. Like, why can't we go play golf at some place where I could play? So she was sitting around back at the farm in Trumbull, Connecticut, or New York, wherever they were at the time, and said, we need to start Golf Digest Women, and started laying the plans with a woman named Verona Cherry. And the two of them launched Golf Digest Women. And, it became pretty successful. And that was really her calling card for a few years before she just got tired of what was her perception, just saying her perception. It was kind of a men's club at Golf Digest, great magazine that it was, and decided to kind of get out of journalism. She had enough and started her music store. But yeah, I mean, that was her in a nutshell. And she passed a lot of the same values on to Sammy and Charlie about, just being the best you can be, being good enough is good enough. Some of those lessons in life that are important. But I think most of all, our kids just observed who she was and how she went about her business, and how, determination can go a long way, right? So,
well, I want to close our session with a wonderful quote that I've heard. Behind every successful man is a very surprised mother-in-law.
well, I want to close with a couple of things, if I may. First of all, I'm blessed. My mother-in-law, Liz's mom, and I have a wonderful relationship.
I know that.
She's a wonderful lady. So if she ever hears this, love you, Renee, or sees this. But I want to tell you about a tradition I had on Mother's Day, since this is about and my birthday. I never kind of figured out why on a birthday it's the person who was birthed who is celebrated as the person who does the birthing. So on my birthday, when I got old enough to afford it, I would send my mom flowers on my birthday, thanking her for birthing me.
That's neat. I've never heard of anybody else doing that. That's so appropriate.
She loved that. So for all of you folks out there on your birthday, if you think of it, send your mom flowers or say thank you or do something to acknowledge her role in this, because, she actually played a pretty big role in you being here.
She did. I started this session today by asking everybody listening how many of them out there actually have a mom or had a mom. And it's the only thing that we all can agree on. 100%. We all had a mom. Some of us had better moms than others, but we all had a mom. And you had a good one.
I was
and
blessed.
I can't thank you enough for being my guest today on this very special Mother's Day session of Shaboom.
Hey, man, it's so great to see you and great to be here. And if our mother's watching, happy Mother's Day. Great job.
Thanks, pal.
Bye-bye.